"I'm too fat to breed," said the rejected mail-order bride, and the whole town laughed. Snow whips across the dusty street as her carpetbag is thrown into the mud. The church bell tolls, cruel voices echo. But just as the jeers rise, a scarred mountain man steps from the crowd, silent, steady, and takes her trembling hand. She thinks her shame ends there. But hidden in her brother's last letter lies a secret deed. Land the richest rancher in town will do anything to steal. Deputies rattle their jail keys, hooves thunder through the snow, and whispers spread that she will be dragged back east in disgrace. Yet in the flicker of lamplight, she discovers a voice no one expected. Her hymn lifting the rafters, stirring hearts that once mocked her. Can a woman the world called too fat to breed hold on to her dignity, her land, and the love of the only man who stood by her? Or will greed and cruelty crush her before the truth comes to light? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through swirling snow and biting wind, the stagecoach rumbled to a stop in front of Henderson's General Store. The wooden wheels crunched against packed ice as townsfolk gathered to witness the arrival of Harlan Pike's mail-order bride. Bee clutched her worn carpetbag closer, her heart thundering beneath her thick winter coat. The conductor offered his hand, helping her descend the steep steps onto the frozen ground. Her cheeks, already pink from the cold, burned brighter as she felt dozens of eyes studying her. Some folks whispered behind gloved hands while others openly stared. Bee forced herself to stand straight despite wanting to shrink into herself. She searched the crowd for the face of Harlan Pike, the rancher whose letters had promised a fresh start, a chance at family, a place to belong. A tall man with a swagger pushed through the onlookers. His expensive coat and polished boots marked him as someone of means, but the cruel twist of his mouth made Bee's stomach clench. This was Harlan Pike, and his expression held none of the warmth his letters had suggested. "This here's what answered my advertisement?" Pike's voice carried across the street, deliberately loud. "Why, she's round as a barrel. Too fat to breed, I reckon." He spat the words like bitter tobacco juice. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some townsfolk had the decency to look away, but others joined in Pike's mockery with sharp barks of their own. Bee felt each laugh like a physical blow. "Please, Mr. Pike," she said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, tend garden." "Ain't interested in excuses," Pike cut her off. He turned to the stagecoach driver who was unloading her trunk. "Don't bother with that. She ain't staying." With a cruel smile, he kicked the trunk, sending it toppling. The latch burst open, spilling Bee's modest belongings onto the dirty snow. Tears pricked at Bee's eyes as she watched her mother's cherished quilts and her few good dresses scatter across the frozen ground. The setting sun cast long shadows through the snowfall, and the first yellow lamplight began to glow in the saloon windows. Night was coming, and she had nowhere to go. Some of her possessions had slid near the boots of the gathered spectators. No one moved to help as Bee knelt in the snow, trying to gather her scattered life with trembling hands. Her fingers were growing numb and her tears threatened to spill over. "Look at her scrambling like a hen after feed," Pike drawled, drawing another round of cruel laughter. The sound of heavy boots crunching through snow made Bee look up. A broad-shouldered man pushed through the crowd with quiet purpose. His face bore a long scar down one cheek, and his beard was flecked with gray, but his movements were sure and steady as he began gathering her belongings. Bee watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the stranger methodically collected her things. His large hands were surprisingly gentle with her mother's quilts, shaking off the snow before folding them with care. When he'd gathered everything, he straightened to his full height and turned to face Pike. The two men locked eyes. The stranger didn't speak, but something in his steady gaze made Pike's smirk falter. The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in power. "Ain't your business, Ward," Pike said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. The man, Ward, continued his silent stare for another long moment before turning to Bee. His face softened as he extended a weathered hand to help her up from the snow. "William Ward, ma'am," he said quietly. His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder without the threat of storm. Bee placed her trembling hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip as he helped her to her feet. "B. Thompson," she whispered, barely audible above the wind. William nodded once, then carefully arranged her belongings in her trunk, securing the latch properly this time. Without a word, he lifted the heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Best we get you somewhere warm," he said, offering his free arm. Bee hesitated only a moment before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. The rough wool of his coat felt solid and real beneath her fingers. Behind them, she could hear Pike's angry muttering, but it seemed far away now, muffled by the falling snow and the steady presence of William beside her. They walked away from the crowd, leaving the main street as true night began to settle over the town. Bee clung to William's arm, her mind spinning between shame at her public humiliation and overwhelming relief at this unexpected rescue. The snow continued to fall softly around them, and their boots left paired tracks in the fresh powder, his large and purposeful, hers smaller but keeping steady pace beside them. As they walked, Bee stole glances at her silent companion. William's profile was stern in the gathering darkness, but there was something gentle in the way he'd handled her belongings, something kind in how he'd faced down Pike without violence or harsh words. His scars spoke of past pain, yet he'd stepped forward to spare her more suffering. The weight of the day's events pressed down on Bee's shoulders. She'd arrived full of nervous hope, only to have her worst fears confirmed in front of the entire town. Pike's cruel words echoed in her mind, reinforcing every doubt she'd ever had about herself. But William's quiet intervention had offered her something precious: dignity in the face of mockery, kindness when she most needed it. The crunch of their boots in the snow and the distant howl of wind through the mountain passes were the only sounds as they made their way through the darkening town. Bee didn't know where William was leading her, but for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something close to safe. Looking ahead through the swirling snow, Bee could make out the warm glow of lamplight from scattered windows. Each one represented a home, a family, all the things she'd hoped to find here. Though Pike had crushed those particular dreams, William's steadying presence beside her suggested that perhaps not all hope was lost in this mountain town. They continued their quiet journey through the deepening night, leaving the sounds of the main street behind them. The snow fell steadily, already beginning to cover their tracks, as if nature itself was trying to erase the memory of Bee's humiliation. She kept pace with William's measured steps, grateful for his solid strength as they made their way through the gathering darkness, toward whatever shelter he had in mind. William's lantern swung in gentle arcs as they walked away from town, casting dancing shadows across the snow-covered path. The flame flickered behind its glass cage, offering just enough light to guide their steps through the gathering darkness. Bee kept close to William's side, grateful for his steady presence as the familiar sounds of town life faded behind them. The path grew more treacherous as they left the packed dirt of the main road. Loose stones and hidden ice lurked beneath the fresh powder, waiting to catch unwary feet. Bee's worn boots, better suited to eastern sidewalks than mountain trails, provided little security on the uncertain ground. A patch of ice caught her unaware. Her foot slipped and she gasped, arms windmilling as she fought for balance. Before she could fall, William's hand caught her elbow, strong and sure. He held her until she found her footing again. "Thank you," Bee whispered, cheeks burning despite the cold. William simply nodded, but his hand lingered at her elbow as they continued walking, ready to steady her again if needed. His quiet patience soothed something raw inside her, still aching from Pike's cruel words and the townspeople's laughter. At the edge of town, where the last buildings gave way to wilderness, William's horse waited. The big bay stood patient in the falling snow, steam rising from its nostrils. William hung the lantern on a nearby post and secured Bee's trunk to the saddle with practiced movements. "Never rode much," Bee admitted, eyeing the horse's tall back with apprehension. "No need to fret." William's voice was soft but certain. "Old Jack here's steady as they come." He cupped his hands to make a step, and Bee gathered her courage. With as much grace as she could manage, she placed her foot in his linked fingers. William lifted her as if she weighed no more than a feather, helping her settle sideways on the saddle, her skirts arranged modestly around her legs. The horse didn't so much as twitch, living up to William's praise. William swung up behind her in one fluid motion, reaching around to gather the reins. The warmth of him at her back helped ward off some of the night's chill as they started down the trail. Snow continued to fall as they rode. the flakes growing thicker and heavier. The dark line of pines loomed ahead, their branches heavy with white. Despite her shawl and coat, Bee couldn't stop shivering. The cold seemed to seep straight through to her bones. William noticed. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy coat, somehow managing the feat while keeping the horse steady. Before Bee could protest, he draped it around her shoulders. The wool still held his warmth, and it smelled of pine smoke and leather. "But you'll freeze," she objected. "I got my sheepskin vest," he replied simply. "Been through worse." They rode on in comfortable silence. The horse's hooves made soft crunching sounds in the snow, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Bee found herself growing drowsy despite the cold, lulled by the steady motion and the sense of safety she felt in William's presence. Just when she thought she couldn't bear the cold a moment longer, a warm glow appeared through the trees. As they drew closer, Bee made out the shape of a cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the night sky. William guided the horse to a small barn beside the cabin, where he helped Bee dismount before tending to Jack. Bee's legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she stamped her feet to restore feeling while William removed her trunk and the saddle. When he finished, he led her to the cabin's door, lifting the latch and ushering her inside. Warmth enveloped her immediately. A fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and the single room smelled wonderfully of wood smoke and what could only be venison stew. A pot hung near the flames, steam rising from beneath its lid. The cabin was small but neat, with a narrow bed against one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and shelves holding basic provisions. "I cannot impose," Bee said quickly, though every fiber of her being yearned to stay in this warm sanctuary. "You've already shown me more kindness than I deserve, but—" "No woman's freezing to death on my watch," William cut in firmly but gently. "Storm's getting worse. You'll stay." As if to emphasize his point, wind rattled the shutters and snow whispered against the window glass. Bee hesitated, then nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she said softly. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." William busied himself with hanging up his snow-covered vest and setting her trunk near the wall. "Stew's been simmering since morning," he said, changing the subject. "Best dish it up before it burns." "Oh," Bee remembered something and hurried to her carpet bag. "I have some bread. It's a bit stale, but—" She pulled out the wrapped loaf she'd brought for her journey. William accepted it with a nod of thanks. He pulled 2 tin bowls from a shelf and ladled generous portions of stew into each. The bread he sliced carefully, laying the pieces on a worn wooden board. They sat at the small table, the lamplight casting warm shadows on the log walls. The stew was rich and flavorful, the meat tender from its long cooking. Even the stale bread tasted good when dipped in the savory broth. Neither spoke as they ate. The silence felt comfortable, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire and the continuous moan of wind outside. Bee found her eyelids growing heavy as warmth and food combined with the exhaustion of the day's events. William noticed her failing struggle to stay awake. Without comment, he rose and went to a trunk in the corner. From it, he pulled a thick bedroll, which he laid out near the hearth where the warmth was strongest. "But where will you sleep?" Bee protested, watching as he added one of his own blankets to make the bed more comfortable. "Got my bedroll for the floor," his tone brooked no argument. "Rest now, you're safe here." Those simple words, "you're safe here," nearly brought tears to Bee's eyes. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you," as she settled onto the bedroll, wrapped in the blankets that smelled of pine and clean mountain air. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rattling the shutters and howling through the trees. But inside the cabin, Bee felt warmth seeping into more than just her chilled body. Here, in this unexpected sanctuary, she found herself cradled in a peace she hadn't known she was seeking. The fire's glow painted patterns on the ceiling as her eyes grew too heavy to keep open. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was William adding another log to the fire, his movements quiet and careful as if protecting her rest. Then darkness took her and she slept more soundly than she had in months, safe in the heart of the storm-wrapped mountain night. Morning light crept through the frosted windows, painting delicate patterns across the cabin's wooden floor. Bee stirred beneath the warm weight of a quilt she didn't remember having when she fell asleep. The fire had burned low, but the cabin remained cozy. Outside, A steady rhythm of axe strikes echoed through the crisp mountain air. Bee sat up slowly, smoothing her rumpled skirts and patting her hair into some semblance of order. Heat rose in her cheeks as she realized William must have covered her with his own quilt during the night. The thoughtful gesture touched her heart even as it embarrassed her. Rising to her feet, she folded the quilt with careful hands and placed it on William's narrow bed. Through the window, she could see him working at the chopping block, his breath clouding in the cold air as he split logs with sure, powerful strokes. The morning sun caught the frost in his beard, and the steam rising from his shoulders. Bee turned her attention to the cabin, needing to keep her hands busy. She stirred the banked coals and added kindling, coaxing the fire back to life. Then she straightened the few dishes from last night's meal, swept the plank floor with the worn broom she found in the corner, and generally tried to make herself useful. Her carpetbag sat where she'd left it by her trunk, and something niggled at her memory. There was something important she needed to check. Kneeling beside the bag, she opened it and carefully removed her few possessions. A spare dress, her mother's prayer book, a small sewing kit. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of muslin, she found what she sought: her brother James's last letter. Her hands trembled as she held it. She'd been too heartsick to open it when it arrived just after news of his death, and then the chaos of answering Pike's advertisement had pushed it from her mind. But now, in this quiet morning moment, something urged her to break the seal. The paper crackled as she unfolded it, and her eyes filled with tears at the sight of James's familiar handwriting. He'd always written with a heavy hand, pressing so hard the words could be felt on the other side of the paper. "Dearest Bee," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then the fever that's been plaguing our camp has claimed me like it did so many others. Don't grieve too hard, little sister. I lived the life I chose, serving my country, and my only regret is leaving you alone." Bee wiped her eyes with her sleeve and read on. As she turned to the second page, something slipped from between the sheets. Another piece of paper, this one official-looking, with an embossed seal. Her heart began to pound as she read the formal language, understanding slowly dawning. It was a deed. James had purchased land, 100 acres of prime grazing meadow in the Colorado Territory, not far from where she sat now. He'd written that he meant it as a surprise for her, a place where she could build a new life away from the memories that haunted their childhood home. The sound of boots stamping snow from their soles made her look up. William entered, arms full of split wood. He paused when he saw her sitting on the floor surrounded by papers, her face tear-stained. "Found something troubling?" he asked quietly, setting the wood carefully in its box by the hearth. Bee held out the deed with shaking hands. "My brother James, he left me land. A meadow north of here." She swallowed hard. "The letter says it borders Pike's ranch." William took the document, his expression growing grave as he read. When he looked up, his jaw was tight. "Know the place. Pike's been trying to claim it for years. Good grazing land, with a year-round spring." He handed the deed back carefully. "He won't take kindly to learning it belongs to you." "I'm cursed," Bee whispered, dropping her face into her hands. "Everywhere I go, I bring trouble. First with Pike rejecting me, and now this. I should never have come here." "No." William's voice was firm but gentle. "You've got as much right to be here as anyone. More now, with that deed." He crouched down beside her, waiting until she met his eyes. "Justice is worth fighting for, even when it's hard. Especially then." Bee managed a wavering smile, touched by his steadfast support. "Thank you. I don't know what to do next." "First thing is breakfast," William said practically, standing and offering her his hand. "Can't think straight on an empty stomach." The simple suggestion of normal routine helped settle Bee's nerves. She tucked the precious deed carefully away and set about making breakfast, grateful for the familiar tasks. She found flour and lard in William's stores and set about making biscuits, working the dough with practiced hands. As she worked, William brought in more wood, showing her how to stack it properly near the fireplace. "Kindling goes here," he explained, arranging the smaller pieces. "Stack it loose, so air can flow through. Makes it catch better." Bee listened carefully, determined to learn. The morning passed in peaceful industry. she tending to indoor tasks while William worked outside, checking his trap lines and caring for his horse. The biscuits turned out well, golden brown and flaky, and they shared them with the last of the venison stew. As dusk began to settle, Bee found herself drawn to the window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Without conscious thought, she began to sing softly, an old hymn her mother had loved. "Be thou my vision." Her voice, though untrained, was sweet and clear, filling the cabin with gentle music. She sang the first verse, then suddenly became aware of the silence behind her. Heat rushed to her face as she turned to find William sitting perfectly still in his chair, eyes closed, listening. "I'm sorry," she stammered, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to disturb." "Please," William said quietly, opening his eyes, "don't stop." Something in his expression, a mixture of peace and longing, gave her courage to continue. She sang the remaining verses, her voice growing stronger, more confident. When the last note faded, William remained silent for a long moment. "Been a long time since these walls heard music," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. They spent the evening in comfortable quiet, William carving a piece of wood while Bee mended a tear she'd noticed in one of his shirts. The fire crackled softly, and outside, an owl called into the gathering night. No words were needed. The trust growing between them spoke loudly enough. Bee felt William's occasional glance in her direction, and though part of her still felt she should be embarrassed by her presence in his home, a deeper part felt strangely at peace. Here, despite the uncertainty of her situation and the trouble that lay ahead, she felt safe, protected, perhaps even beginning to feel something she hadn't dared hope for in a long time, a sense of belonging. The evening deepened around them, stars appearing in the clear mountain sky outside the windows. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this quiet moment of companionship, Bee allowed herself to simply be grateful for the unexpected sanctuary she'd found. Morning came crisp and bright, sunlight glinting off the fresh snow. William stood at the window, studying the weather while Bee tidied away their breakfast dishes. "Need supplies from town," he said, turning from the window. "Flour's running low and we could use some lamp oil." He paused, watching her carefully. "Might be best if you come along. Can't hide up here forever." Bee's hand stilled on the dish she was drying. The thought of facing the townspeople again made her stomach clench, but she knew he was right. "Yes," she said softly. "I suppose we must." William nodded approvingly at her courage. "I'll saddle the horse." While he went to the stable, Bee gathered her shawl, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. The wool was thin in places, but it was all she had. She tucked the deed safely into her pocket, unwilling to leave it behind. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. William helped her mount, then swung up behind her. His solid presence at her back offered comfort as they started down the snowy trail toward town. The horse's hooves crunched through the frozen crust, and Bee found herself pressing back slightly against William's chest, grateful for the warmth he provided. As they approached the town, Bee's anxiety grew. The main street was busy with morning traffic, wagons creaking through the snow, townspeople hurrying about their business. Heads turned as William guided the horse toward the general store, and whispers followed in their wake. "That's Pike's rejected bride," she heard someone say, the words carrying clearly in the cold air. Other whispers followed, some pitying, some cruel. Bee kept her eyes fixed on the horn of the saddle until William drew them to a halt. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down, his hands steady and sure at her waist. The brief touch gave her strength as they approached the store's entrance, and a bell tinkled as they entered the warm interior. The storekeeper, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger. His welcoming expression froze when he recognized Bee, and he glanced uncertainly toward the door. William stepped forward, his presence filling the small space. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins." The storekeeper shifted uncomfortably under William's steady gaze. "Mr. Ward," he managed, then reluctantly added, "Ma'am." Bee moved quietly through the store, selecting what they needed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for bags of beans and sugar, but she forced herself to continue. William stayed close, his broad shoulders between her and the door like a shield. They were just finishing their shopping when the bell rang again. this time with violent force. Harlan Pike stood in the doorway, his face dark with rage. Behind him, Bee could see several deputies lounging against the hitching post, studiously looking anywhere but at the store. Well, well, Pike sneered, stalking forward. If it ain't the fraud and her protector? Bee instinctively stepped back, but William moved forward, placing himself between them. Pike's face reddened further. You think you're clever, don't you? He spat at Bee. Coming here with your lies, trying to steal what's rightfully mine? As if any real man would want you. His voice dripped with contempt. Look at you. You're not fit to be any man's wife. That's enough. William's voice was quiet but carried an edge of steel that made even Pike pause. The lady has done nothing wrong. Pike's laugh was ugly. Lady? That's rich. She's nothing but a scheming... I said enough. William took a step forward, and though he hadn't raised his voice, something in his tone made Pike fall silent. You'd do well to watch your tongue, Pike. Through the window, Bee could see the deputies shifting uneasily, but they made no move to enter. Their loyalty to Pike, or their fear of him, was clear in their studied indifference. This isn't over, Pike snarled, backing toward the door. Not by a long shot. He shot one last venomous look at Bee before storming out. Bee realized she was gripping William's sleeve only when he gently covered her hand with his own. She was shaking, she noticed distantly. Mr. Jenkins, William said calmly as if nothing had happened. We'll take these supplies now. The storekeeper hurried to total their purchases, eager to have them gone. William paid, then gathered the packages while Bee stood close to his side, her legs feeling none too steady. Outside, the deputies had disappeared, but curious faces watched from every window as William loaded their supplies onto the horse. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching in Bee's hair as William helped her mount. They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them. The snow thickened, creating a hushed world of white. Finally, Bee found her voice. I should go, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. You shouldn't have to face such trouble because of me. William's arms tightened slightly around her as he guided the horse around a bend in the trail. It isn't you who ought to be ashamed, he said firmly. Pike's the one bringing trouble, not you. Bee fell silent, but her heart lifted slightly at his words. The snow continued to fall as they made their way up the mountain, and by the time they reached the cabin, night was settling in. The windows glowed with welcome, William having banked the fire well before they left. Inside, the familiar warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a blanket. William built up the fire while Bee put away their supplies, her hand steadier now. The flames caught and crackled, pushing back the shadows, and with them some of her fear. Looking at William's broad back as he hung their snow-dampened coats by the fire, Bee felt a surge of gratitude. In just a few days, this rough cabin had become more of a home than any place she'd known since her parents died. And William. William had become something she hardly dared name, even to herself. The firelight flickered across the walls, creating a circle of warmth and safety against the gathering night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but here, for now at least, Bee felt protected. Tomorrow's troubles would come soon enough, but this evening, she allowed herself to simply exist in this moment of peace. The snow fell in thick curtains piling against the cabin walls. Wind howled through the pines, but inside, warmth and routine began to settle between Bee and William. Morning light filtered weakly through frosted windows as Bee stirred a pot of beans and salt pork, adding dried herbs from her carefully packed stores. William worked near the door, his broad shoulders hunched over a stubborn roof leak that had appeared overnight. Water dripped steadily into a tin bucket, the ping-ping-ping marking time as surely as any clock. He'd climbed up earlier to pack snow and branches over the worst of it, but indoor repairs needed attention too. Reckon we'll be here a spell, he said, testing a board with calloused hands. Trail won't be passable for at least 2 days, maybe more. Bee nodded, trying to hide her relief at the forced confinement. Here, at least, she felt safe from Pike's cruel eyes and cutting words. I've made enough stew to last, she said, stirring the pot. And there's still cornmeal for bread. William glanced up, a hint of approval warming his usual stoic expression. Much obliged. Been a while since I had proper cooking. The day settled into a rhythm of necessary tasks. While William ventured out for more firewood, wrapped against the bitter cold, Bee took stock of their supplies. She organized the cabin's sparse shelves, finding comfort and creating order from chaos. When William returned, snow crusting his coat and boots, she had hot coffee waiting. As afternoon dimmed toward evening, Bee noticed William struggling with a torn shirt sleeve. Without comment, she retrieved her small sewing kit from her carpet bag. "May I?" William hesitated, then handed over the worn garment. Bee's fingers moved surely, making neat stitches that almost disappeared into the fabric. William watched with unconcealed surprise. "My mother taught me," she explained softly. "Said a woman should know how to make things whole again." Her voice caught slightly on the memory. "She taught you well," William said, examining the mended sleeve. Something in his tone made Bee look up, catching a shadow of old pain crossing his face. That evening, as lamplight cast dancing shadows on the log walls, William spoke of his own loss. His voice was low, almost harsh with disuse, as he described the fever that had taken his wife Sarah and their infant son in a single, terrible week. "Couldn't do nothing but watch them slip away," he said, staring into the fire. "Doctor was 3 days' ride. By the time he came." He fell silent, his scarred face etched with remembered helplessness. Bee's heart ached for him. She understood now why he'd chosen this solitary life, why the cabin felt both sanctuary and prison. "How long ago?" she asked gently. 5 years this spring." His fingers traced unconsciously over the scar that ran from temple to jaw, a separate injury, she guessed, but somehow linked in his mind with that time of loss. Silence settled between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of burning wood. Finally, Bee found herself speaking of her own wounds, the parents taken by influenza, the brother who'd gone to war and never truly returned, his death leaving her alone with nothing but a deed that had brought her to this place. "I thought," she swallowed hard, "I thought answering Pike's advertisement would give me purpose again, a chance to be useful, to belong somewhere." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I knew I wasn't beautiful like the women in those penny novels, but I believed hard work and a willing heart might make up for it." "Pike's a fool," William said firmly, surprising her with his vehemence. "Judges worth by all the wrong measures." Bee felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. William didn't offer empty comfort or pitying platitudes. His respect was as solid and real as the walls sheltering them from the storm. The second day of their confinement passed similarly. William split more wood, stacking it carefully along the cabin's inner wall. Bee cooked and cleaned, singing softly as she worked. She caught William pausing sometimes, head cocked, listening to her quiet hymns though she never quite finished them, too shy to continue when she noticed his attention. That evening, she darned his socks while he cleaned his rifle, their companionable silence broken only by the howling wind. The simple domesticity of it almost broke her heart. This taste of what might have been, what still might be if fate were kind. On the third morning, the storm finally began to ease. Sunlight pierced the clouds, setting the snow-covered landscape ablaze with diamond brightness. William stepped outside to check conditions, returning with frost in his beard, but satisfaction in his eyes. "Trail should be clear by tomorrow," he said, stamping snow from his boots. Then, after a moment's consideration, "Might be wise if you learn to handle a rifle." Bee's eyes widened. I've never... No better time to learn." His tone was matter-of-fact, brooking no argument. He brought out his spare rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that seemed enormous in Bee's hands. With infinite patience, William showed her how to hold it properly, how to sight along the barrel, how to breathe steady when preparing to fire. "Like this?" she asked, trembling slightly as she raised the weapon. William's hands were warm and sure as he adjusted her grip. "That's it. Now see that snowbank yonder? Just squeeze the trigger gentle-like when you're ready." Bee drew a deep breath, trying to still her shaking hands. The rifle's weight seemed to grow with each passing second. Finally, she squeezed the trigger. The report was deafening in the snow-muffled world. She stumbled slightly from the recoil, but William's hand at her elbow kept her steady. A spray of snow flew up where the bullet struck the bank. Nervous laughter bubbled up from Bee's chest, surprising them both. "I did it!" William's eyes crinkled at the corners, not quite a smile, but warming his whole face nonetheless. "That you did." They spent another hour practicing until Bee's shoulder ached, but her hands were steadier. The activity had brought color to her cheeks and a light to her eyes that made William's chest tighten in ways he wasn't ready to examine too closely. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the snow, Bee's voice rose clear and sweet in the cabin's warmth. For the first time, she didn't falter or fall silent when she caught William listening. The hymn's familiar words filled the space between them. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. William closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. How long had it been since music had filled these walls, since any voice but his own had echoed in this lonely place? Something tight in his chest began to loosen, like ice melting in spring. When the last note faded, neither spoke for a long moment. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the snow-hushed valley. But inside, the silence was comfortable, filled with understanding that went deeper than words. Bee busied herself with the dishes, humming softly, while William added another log to the fire. Their movements around each other had grown easier, more natural, as if they'd been sharing this space for months rather than days. The storm that had forced them together had also given them time to learn each other's rhythms, to find comfort in simple shared tasks and quiet companionship. As night settled fully over the mountain, Bee wrapped herself in the quilt William had given her that first night. She caught him watching her from his place by the fire, his expression thoughtful in the flickering light. So much had changed since she'd stepped off that stage into mockery and rejection. Here, in this humble cabin with this quiet man, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was seeking: respect, understanding, and perhaps the first delicate tendrils of something more. The wind had died down completely now, leaving only the peaceful silence of a snow-wrapped world. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they were content in the warmth of newfound trust and companionship. A week of peaceful routine had settled over William's cabin. Each morning, Bee rose early to cook breakfast while William tended to outdoor chores. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing meals and quiet conversation. But this Sunday morning felt different. Bee's hands trembled as she pinned her best bonnet, preparing for their first venture to town church together. William hitched the wagon in silence, his jaw set with determination. He'd insisted they attend services, though Bee had protested, fearing another confrontation with Pike. The morning air was crisp and clear, as William helped her up onto the wooden seat. His hand lingered reassuringly on her arm before he took up the reins. The wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ground as they made their way down the mountain. Bee clutched her worn Bible in her lap, trying to still her racing heart. William seemed to sense her anxiety, keeping the horses at an unhurried pace. "Ain't nothing to fear," he said quietly. "Lord's house is open to all." Bee managed a small nod, though her throat felt too tight for words. As they approached town, she could see other wagons and riders converging on the modest white clapboard church. The bell tolled clear across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. William guided their wagon to a spot near the hitching post. Before helping her down, he straightened his string tie and brushed dust from his coat. The care he'd taken with his appearance touched something deep in Bee's heart. Heads turned as they walked toward the church steps. Whispers followed them like autumn leaves skittering across the ground. Bee kept her eyes down, clutching her Bible closer. Without hesitation, William took her hand in his calloused one. The simple gesture silenced some of the murmuring, though others still stared. Inside, the church was warm with morning sunlight streaming through plain glass windows. William led them to a pew near the middle, not hiding in the back, but not drawing attention up front either. As they settled, Bee caught fragments of whispered conversations. Pike's mail-order bride, living up at Ward's cabin, the nerve of them. Bee's cheeks burned, but William's steady presence beside her helped her endure the scrutiny. When the minister called them to prayer, she bowed her head gratefully, letting the familiar words wash over her like cool water. The service proceeded with hymns and scripture readings. Bee's voice joined others in singing Rock of Ages, though she kept it soft. William didn't sing, but his shoulder pressed reassuringly against hers whenever the whispers grew noticeable. After the final Amen, people began to file out, some nodding politely, others deliberately looking away. Bee's hands twisted nervously in her skirts as they waited their turn to exit the pew. That's when a slender figure approached, an Apache woman wearing a simple calico dress and dark shawl. "William Ward," the woman said, her voice gentle but firm. "It is good to see you here." "Nellen," William touched his hat brim respectfully. "Been too long." Nollan's dark eyes settled on Bee with warmth. "I remember when this man stood against Pike's men who were trying to run my cattle off the winter grazing land. He has a good heart." Bee looked up in surprise, both at the story and the kindness in Nollan's voice. "The land belonged to your people first," William said simply. "Pike had no right." Nollan nodded, then spoke directly to Bee. "I have heard how Pike treated you. Do not measure your worth by his words. Such men see only what can be taken, never what can be given." She touched Bee's arm gently. "You have kind eyes and strong hands. These matter more than shape or size." Tears welled in Bee's eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, throat tight with emotion. "Come visit me," Nollan said. "I live near the creek where the willows grow thick. We can share tea and stories." Before Bee could respond, a commotion near the church door drew their attention. Harlan Pike stood there, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him apart from the other ranchers, his cold gaze fixed on their small group. "Well, if it ain't the Holy Rollers," Pike drawled, loud enough for all to hear. "Ward, you're making a fool of yourself harboring that woman. Ain't nothing good gonna come of it." William's hand tightened on Bee's arm, but his voice remained steady. "Reckon that's between me and the Lord, Pike." "Reckon it's between you and the law," Pike shot back, "especially when certain property matters come to light." Sheriff Greeley appeared then, his badge glinting dully in the sunlight. "Now, folks, this is the Lord's house. Let's keep things peaceful." But his weak attempt at peacekeeping clearly favored Pike's side. The sheriff's eyes slid away from William's direct gaze, showing where his loyalties lay. "Just giving friendly warning," Pike smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Some folks don't know when they're better off leaving well enough alone." William drew himself up to his full height. "And some folks don't know when they're speaking nothing but hot air." The tension crackled between them until Pike finally turned away with a mocking tip of his hat. The sheriff followed, already deferring to Pike's next words. Nollan watched them go, her expression grave. "That man's hunger for land knows no bounds. Be careful, both of you." The ride home seemed longer than the morning journey. Bee sat rigid beside William, her thoughts churning like storm clouds. The warmth of Nollan's kindness warred with the chill of Pike's threats. When they finally reached the cabin, Bee's hands shook so badly she could hardly unpin her bonnet. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door," she said miserably, watching William build up the fire. "Pike will never leave you in peace while I'm here." William straightened from the hearth, his expression thoughtful in the growing firelight. "Pike's been troubling folks long before you arrived. Man like that needs opposing, else he'll take everything that ain't nailed down." Bee busied herself preparing their simple supper of beans and cornbread, trying to hide her distress. But when they sat down to eat, she couldn't help voicing her fears. "I don't understand why you risk so much for me. I'm nobody, just a failed mail-order bride who's caused you nothing but difficulty." William set down his spoon, regarding her steadily across the table. "You recall the story of Ruth in that Bible of yours?" Bee nodded, uncertain where he was leading. Stranger in a strange land she was. No claim to anything but her own 2 hands and willing heart. Yet God used her to mend what was broken. His voice grew soft. "Sometimes the Lord sends people to heal more than just their own hurts." He looked at her then with such quiet certainty that Bee's breath caught in her throat. In his clear gaze, she saw not pity or obligation, but something deeper. Recognition of shared wounds, shared healing. For the first time since stepping off that stage into mockery and rejection, Bee felt the tender shoots of belonging taking root in her heart. This cabin, this man, even the challenges they faced together. Perhaps this was where she'd been meant to land all along. The evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket. Outside, a lone coyote called to the rising moon. Inside, The fire crackled softly as they finished their meal in companionable silence. Tomorrow would bring its own trials. But for now, Bee let herself rest in the simple grace of being accepted, being valued, being home. The following week brought crisp autumn air and early sunsets. As evening approached, William hitched the wagon while Bee stood uncertainly on the cabin's porch, twisting her shawl in her hands. "I don't know about this," she said softly. "What if they laugh again?" William paused in his work, looking up at her. "Ain't nobody gonna laugh at God's house tonight. Pastor Thompson himself invited us special for the hymn service." Bee smoothed her freshly pressed dress, her one good garment saved for special occasions. The deep blue fabric had faded somewhat, but careful mending kept it presentable. She'd spent an hour pinning her hair just so, trying to make herself as proper as possible. William helped her into the wagon with gentle hands. The leather creaked as he settled beside her, clucking to the horses. Stars were just beginning to pepper the darkening sky as they set out, the wagon's wheels crunching over fallen leaves. "You don't have to sing if you don't want to," William said after a while, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "But I reckon folks ought to hear what the Lord blessed you with." Bee's cheeks warmed at his words. He'd heard her singing while she worked around the cabin, though she always stopped when she realized he was listening. The thought of singing in front of others made her stomach twist with nerves. Oil lamps glowed in the church windows as they approached, their light spilling onto the packed dirt of the street. Several wagons were already tied up outside. William helped Bee down, his hand lingering supportively at her elbow, as they walked to the door. Inside, the small church was transformed by lamplight. Golden light danced on the wooden walls, and the plain glass windows reflected back like mirrors against the darkness outside. People filled the pews, their voices a quiet murmur of greeting and conversation. Bee held her breath as they entered, but the hostile stares she'd feared didn't materialize. Instead, Mrs. Thompson, the pastor's wife, hurried over with a warm smile. "We're so glad you could come," she said, clasping Bee's hands. "William mentioned you have a gift for sacred music." Bee shot William a look. He hadn't told her about that conversation. He merely smiled, touching the brim of his hat to Mrs. Thompson. They found seats near the middle of the church, the same spot they'd occupied during Sunday service. This time, though, fewer heads turned to stare. Nalin was there too, sitting with her teenage daughter. She caught Bee's eye and nodded in greeting. Pastor Thompson stood at the front, his kind face glowing in the lamplight. "Welcome, friends," he began. "Tonight we gather to lift our voices in praise and share testimonies of God's grace. Who would like to begin?" Several people stood to sing or speak. Mrs. Miller shared how prayer had helped her through a difficult winter. Young Tom Wesley, usually shy, sang "Amazing Grace" in a clear tenor. Each offering was met with warm appreciation. "Anyone else feel led to share?" the pastor asked, his eyes scanning the congregation. William's hand found Bee's, squeezing gently. She looked at him, startled as he stood. "Bee has a hymn to share," he said simply. Her heart thundered as every eye turned their way. But William's steady presence and the encouraging smiles around her gave her courage. Slowly, she rose to her feet. For a moment, she couldn't find her voice, then she remembered singing in her family's kitchen as a girl, her mother's voice joining hers while bread baked and sunlight streamed through windows. The memory wrapped around her like a warm embrace. She began softly, her voice trembling slightly. "There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole." The first notes quavered, but as she continued, her voice grew stronger. The old hymn of healing and hope rose clear and true, filling the small church with its message of mercy. Her eyes closed as she sang, letting the familiar words carry her. The congregation sat silent, caught in the spell of her voice. Even those who had been skeptical of her before sat transfixed. The lamplight seemed to glow brighter, as if the very air was charged with sacred energy. As the final note faded into the rafters, Bee opened her eyes. Pastor Thompson was nodding, clearly moved. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. William's face held a look of such pride and tenderness that it nearly brought fresh tears to her own eyes. "Amen," the pastor said softly. "Truly, the Lord has blessed us tonight." Bee sat down, her cheeks flushed. William's calloused hand found hers again, this time holding it openly on the pew between them. The simple gesture spoke volumes, not just of affection, but of public acknowledgement. He wasn't hiding their growing connection. The rest of the service passed in a blur of other songs and testimonies, but Bea barely heard them. She was too aware of William's thumb occasionally stroking across her knuckles, of the accepting smiles now directed her way. When the evening drew to a close, several women approached her. Mrs. Miller clasped her hands warmly. "What a beautiful gift," she said. "You must join our choir. We practice on Wednesday afternoons." "Your voice would be most welcome," added Mrs. Thompson. "And perhaps you'd share your cornbread recipe?" William mentioned it's quite something. Bea glanced at William again. Just how many conversations had he had about her? He was talking with some of the men, but she caught him watching her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'd like that," Bea said, meaning it. "Thank you." The wagon ride home was peaceful, the night air cool and sweet. Bea found herself leaning against William's solid shoulder, drinking in the comfort of his presence. "I never thought," she whispered, her voice catching. "I never dreamed I could belong somewhere like this." William's arms slipped around her shoulders, tucking her closer against his side as he guided the horses with his other hand. "You belong more than most," he said softly. "Reckon you belonged here before you even knew it." When they reached the cabin, the familiar sight of it waiting in the darkness made Bea's heart swell. Light from their lantern spilled across the porch as William opened the door. Inside, he built up the fire while Bea hung her shawl and smoothed her hair, still humming softly. The flames caught quickly, filling the cabin with warm light. Bea knelt by the hearth, clasping her hands in her lap. Words of gratitude rose naturally to her lips as she closed her eyes in prayer. William moved quietly around the cabin, but she could feel his presence, solid and reassuring. When she opened her eyes, she found him watching her from his chair, his expression tender in the firelight. Something new and precious hung in the air between them, something that went beyond mere friendship or convenience. The cabin seemed to glow with it, as if the very walls had absorbed the warmth of their growing feelings. Bea's heart felt full to bursting with the simple joy of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. The mockery and rejection that had marked her arrival felt like a distant memory, washed away by song and acceptance and the steady light in William's eyes. 3 days after the church gathering, the peaceful rhythm of cabin life shattered with approaching hoofbeats. William was checking his trap lines while Bea hung laundry, her arms deep in a basket of clean shirts. The rider's arrival sent chicken scattering. "Ma'am," the young man touched his hat, looking uncomfortable. "Word from town you ought to hear." He shifted in his saddle, glancing toward the cabin door. "Is Mr. Ward about?" "He's checking traps," Bea said, clutching a damp shirt to her chest. "What news?" The rider, Jimmy from the general store, cleared his throat. "Pike's been showing papers around town. Says he can prove your deed's false, ma'am. Been making quite a stir about it." Bea's hands trembled on the wet fabric. "That's impossible. My brother's deed is genuine." "Yes'm," Jimmy nodded, though doubt clouded his young face. "Just thought you should know. Pike's gathered quite a crowd at the saloon showing some document or other." When William returned an hour later, Bea met him at the door, wringing her hands in her apron. The news tumbled out between shaky breaths. His face hardened as she spoke, jaw tightening beneath his beard. "We'll ride in," he said firmly. "See these so-called papers ourselves." The ride to town felt endless, though it couldn't have been more than an hour. Bea sat behind William on his horse, one arm wrapped around his solid waist, the other clutching her brother's deed close to her heart. The sealed document had traveled with her from back east, carried carefully through all the miles and heartache that led her here. Main Street buzzed with unusual activity for a weekday afternoon. A cluster of men stood outside the saloon, their voices carrying on the crisp air. William helped Bea down from the horse, keeping her hand in his as they approached. Inside, Pike held court at the bar, a piece of paper spread before him. His voice boomed through the smoky air. "Got proof right here," he declared, jabbing a finger at the document. "That meadow's been mine fair and square these past 2 years. This here paper shows the sale, signed and witnessed proper." Bea's heart pounded as she pushed through the crowd, William close behind her. She pulled her brother's deed from her pocket, hands shaking. "That's not possible," she said, her voice smaller than she wished. "My brother left me this land. His signature is right here, witnessed by the county clerk back east." Pike's face twisted into a sneer. "Your brother?" He spat on the sawdust floor. "That drunk couldn't sign his own name straight, let alone deed valuable grazing land." Several men chuckled, though others looked away uncomfortably. William's hand moved to his revolver, but Bee grabbed his arm. "Please," she whispered, "no violence." Sheriff Greeley pushed through the crowd, looking tired and drawn. He studied both documents, though his eyes kept darting to Pike's imposing figure. "Miss," he said finally, "I'm afraid Mr. Pike's claim appears sound. His document bears the territorial seal." He paused, adjusting his badge. "If you persist in claiming ownership, I'll have no choice but to consider it attempted fraud." "Fraud?" Bee's voice cracked. "But my brother—" "Your brother was a no-account drunk who died in the gutter," Pike cut in. "Everyone knows it. Now clear out before I have the sheriff arrest you proper." William's whole body tensed, his hand still on his gun. The saloon grew deadly quiet, everyone watching to see what would happen next. Bee felt tears threatening, but forced them back. "William," she pleaded softly, "please, let's go." For a long moment he stood rigid, staring Pike down. Then slowly, deliberately, he removed his hand from his weapon. Without a word, he guided Bee through the silent crowd and out into the afternoon sun. The ride home passed in heavy silence. Bee pressed her face against William's back, letting silent tears soak into his coat. The deed that had given her hope now felt like ashes in her pocket. Night settled over the cabin, bringing no peace. William paced the wooden floor, his boots marking a steady rhythm. The familiar sound of his steps usually comforted Bee, but tonight it only heightened her distress. She stood at the table, kneading bread dough with trembling hands, trying to find solace in the familiar task. "It's forged," William said for the third time, his voice rough with anger. "That paper of Pike's is nothing but lies, same as everything else about him." Bee pressed her palms into the dough, watching flour dust rise in the lamplight. "The sheriff believes him." "Sheriff's a coward." William's steps quickened. "Always has been. Lets Pike run roughshod over anyone smaller than him." "I should never have come here," Bee whispered, her voice catching. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." William stopped pacing. "And don't say that. It's true." Tears fell freely now, spotting the dough beneath her hands. "Everything I touch turns to ashes. I thought maybe here." She broke off, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The floor creaked as William crossed to her. His hand covered hers in the dough, strong fingers wrapping around her flour-dusted ones. He knelt beside her, turning her gently to face him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You are not a curse. You're the fight God put in my path." Bee tried to pull away, but he held firm. "Pike will destroy you because of me." "Pike's been destroying things long before you came." William's scarred face was fierce in the lamplight. "Been pushing folks around, taking what he wants, breaking whatever stands in his way. Maybe it's time someone pushed back." "I'm not worth the fight," she whispered. William's other hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away tears. "You're worth every fight. Every single one." Outside, wind rattled the cabin's shutters, its mournful howl matching the storm of emotions in Bee's heart. She looked into William's eyes, seeing determination there, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "I won't let him win," William said softly. "Not this time. Not with you." Bee closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The wind continued its wild song outside, but here in the lamp-lit cabin, with William's strong hands steadying her, she found a moment of peace. Whatever storm was building between them and Pike, they would face it together. William's thumb traced her cheek once more before he stood, reluctantly releasing her hand. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "Truth has a way of coming to light." Bee turned back to her bread dough, her hands steadier now. As she worked, she began to hum softly. Not a hymn this time, but an old lullaby her mother used to sing. The familiar melody filled the cabin, weaving between the wind's howls like a thread of gold through dark cloth. William resumed his pacing, but slower now, more thoughtful than angry. Each step seemed to say what his words had already declared, that he would stand with her, fight for her, believe in her worth when she couldn't believe in it herself. The storm beyond the walls grew fiercer, but inside the lamp burned steady. Bee shaped her dough into loaves, letting the simple work ground her. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight they had bread to bake, warmth to share, and a strength between them that even Pike's lies couldn't shake. A heavy gray dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden forest in shades of pewter and ash. Inside William's cabin, Bee stirred porridge over the cook fire, while William cleaned his rifle near the window, their morning routine as familiar now as breathing. The sudden pounding on the door shattered their quiet like a gunshot. "Open up, sheriff's business," the spoon slipped from Bee's fingers, clattering against the iron pot. William was on his feet in an instant, rifle steady in his hands. "Stay behind me," he murmured, moving toward the door. More fists hammered the wooden planks. William Ward, "Open this door or we'll break it down." William pulled the door open, keeping his rifle visible but pointed downward. Sheriff Greeley stood on the porch, flanked by 2 deputies, their breath clouded in the frigid morning air. "What's your business here, Sheriff?" William's voice was calm, but Bee could hear the tension underneath. Greeley shifted uncomfortably, not meeting William's eyes. "Got papers here for the arrest of Miss Beatrice Collins. Charges of attempted land fraud against Mr. Pike." "That's nonsense, and you know it." William's knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. "Step aside, Ward." One of the deputies, a narrow-faced man with cold eyes, rested his hand on his holstered pistol. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Bee's heart thundered in her chest as she watched William's shoulders stiffen. The morning air crackled with danger. "William," she called softly, her voice trembling. "Please don't fight them." He half turned toward her, pain etched across his scarred features. In that moment of distraction, the deputies surged forward. One knocked the rifle from William's hands while the other grabbed Bee roughly by the arm. "No." William lunged forward, but the narrow-faced deputy swung his rifle butt hard, catching William across the temple. He crumpled into the snow, blood streaming down his face. "William!" Bee screamed, struggling against the deputy's iron grip. Rough rope bit into her wrists as they bound them behind her back. "Stop fighting, miss," Greeley said, not unkindly. "Don't want anyone else getting hurt." They dragged her toward a waiting wagon, her boots leaving desperate tracks in the snow. William stirred, trying to push himself up on shaking arms. "Bee," he gasped, blood matting his beard. "I'll come for you. I swear it." The deputy shoved her onto the wagon's wooden bed. As they pulled away, she caught one last glimpse of William through her tears, a dark figure kneeling in bloodied snow, reaching toward her with trembling hands. The wagon jolted down the mountain path, every bump sending pain through Bee's bound wrists. Neither deputy spoke to her, and Sheriff Greeley rode ahead, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. By the time they reached town, the morning had warmed enough to turn the streets to mud. Townsfolk stopped to stare as the wagon passed, whispers following in its wake. Bee kept her head down, shame burning hotter than her tears. The jailhouse was a squat stone building behind the sheriff's office. Its small barred windows stared out like dead eyes. Inside, a narrow cell waited, iron bars casting thin shadows across the dirt floor. "I'm sorry about this," Greeley muttered as he locked the cell door. "But the law's the law." Bee sank onto the thin pallet in the corner, her unbound wrists aching. What law says a man can steal with forged papers and jail the innocent? The sheriff had no answer. It left her alone with her grief and the endless ticking of the office clock beyond the bars. Hours crawled past. The winter sun wheeled overhead, sending bars of light creeping across the cell floor. Bee paced, prayed, and finally slumped against the cold stone wall, too exhausted even for tears. The sound of uneven footsteps outside her window roused her. William's battered face appeared between the bars, dried blood still crusting his temple. "Bee," he breathed, pressing his hand against the window. "Thank God you're alive." She rushed to the window, reaching through the bars to touch his fingers. "Your head? Are you badly hurt?" "Nothing that matters," and his eyes were fierce despite the pain clouding them. "I'm getting you out of here." "How?" Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Pike has everyone believing his lies. The law itself is against us." "There's a higher law than Pike's corruption." William sank to his knees in the snow, still gripping her hand through the bars. His voice rose in quiet prayer. "Lord, you see every injustice, every lie that twists your truth. Show us your way through this darkness. Let your justice shine like the dawn." Bee pressed her forehead against the cold iron. "I was such a fool," she whispered, "thinking I could matter. thinking I deserved a place here. Don't say that, William's fingers tightened on hers. You matter more than you know. To this town. To me. A deputy's voice cut through the gathering dusk. Ward, get away from there. I'll be back, William promised. Hold on to hope, B. God hasn't abandoned us. He struggled to his feet, limping away into the shadows. B watched until his figure disappeared, then slid down the wall to huddle on her pallet. Outside her window, snow began to fall again. Through the bars, she could see William's kneeling imprint in the white powder, testament to his stubborn faith. His blood stained the snow like scattered roses. But still he had come. Still, he believed. Bee drew her knees to her chest, shivering in the growing cold. The cell's shadows lengthened as night crept in, but she fixed her gaze on those crimson drops in the snow. William's blood, spilled in her defense. His prayers, rising like incense in the winter air. His promise, burning like a lamp in the darkness. She began to hum softly, the same hymn she had sung in church when the rafters rang with hope and William's hand had covered hers in blessing. The melody wound through the iron bars, a thread of gold in the gathering night. Beyond her window, snow continued to fall, covering William's bloodstains with fresh white powder. But underneath, the evidence remained, of love, of sacrifice, of a man who knelt in winter's heart to pray for justice. In her cold cell, Bee huddled closer to the wall, holding that image close. William Ward, battered but unbroken, kneeling in the snow beneath her window. Whatever tomorrow might bring, that picture would sustain her through the long, dark night ahead. The jail clock ticked steadily onward, counting moments until dawn. Bee closed her eyes, remembering William's words. Hold on to hope. Outside, snow fell like grace upon the sleeping town, covering all in silent white, bloodstains and boot prints, justice and corruption, love and loss, until morning's light would reveal what lay beneath. Snow crunched beneath Nolan's boots as she made her way up the path to William's cabin. Her woven shawl caught the morning light, its bright patterns stark against the white landscape. In her basket, clean bandages and herbal poultices nestled beside cornbread still warm from her hearth. She found William slumped on his front step, pressing a cloth to his temple where the rifle butt had struck. Blood had dried in his beard, and his eyes were glazed with pain. You need tending, Nolan said simply, setting her basket down. Let me help. William tried to wave her away. I'm fine. Need to get back to town. You will do B no good if you collapse in the street. Nolan's firm tone brooked no argument. She guided him inside the cabin and sat him by the cold hearth. As she cleaned his wound with gentle hands, Nolan spoke quietly. I have been thinking about the Meadow deed. My husband, before he was killed, witnessed its signing. William went very still beneath her ministrations. Your husband saw B's brother sign the deed? Yes. Nolan wrapped a clean bandage around his head. He worked as a translator between the land office and our people. He was there the day Thomas Collins registered his claim. Hope flickered in William's eyes. That testimony could prove Pike's document is false. Perhaps. Nolan's hand stilled. But who will believe an Apache widow over a powerful rancher? The council sees me as less than nothing. Your voice matters, William said firmly, catching her wrist. The truth matters no matter who speaks it. Nolan met his gaze steadily. Truth did not save my husband when Pike's men drove us from our grazing lands. Truth did not stop them from killing him. But help me make truth count this time. William's voice was rough with emotion. Help me save B from Pike's lies and... Nolan was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes distant with memory. Finally, she nodded. I will speak. For B. For my husband. For all those Pike has wronged. Thank you. William pressed her hand in gratitude. Now eat, she commanded, unwrapping the cornbread. You need strength for what lies ahead. As the sun climbed higher, word of B's arrest spread through town like wildfire. Children whispered about the lady who sang like an angel, now locked behind iron bars. Women remembered her gentle ways at church. Even those who had laughed at Pike's cruel rejection began to question his accusations. In her cell, B huddled on the thin pallet, trying to stay warm. The stone walls seemed to leach heat from her very bones. When footsteps approached, she looked up to find Reverend Matthews standing outside the bars. "Miss Collins," he said kindly, "may I come in?" Sheriff Greeley unlocked the cell and the preacher stepped inside. He settled onto the wooden stool, his Bible open in his weathered hands. "I brought you some words of comfort," he said, turning worn pages with care. "Listen, the Lord hears the cry of the oppressed. He is not deaf to their call." Tears welled in Bee's eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if he hears me at all." "He hears." The preacher's voice was gentle but firm. "And he works through those who stand for justice. William Ward has not given up. Neither should you." "I'm trying to keep faith," Bee whispered, "but Pike's lies seem stronger than truth." "Truth has a power all its own." Reverend Matthews squeezed her hand through the bars. "It cannot be buried forever." After the preacher left, Bee pressed her face against the cold iron, watching the winter sun sink toward the mountains. Outside her window, she could hear children's voices carrying on the evening air. "She sang so pretty in church," one small voice said, "like heaven itself." "My ma says it ain't right her being in jail," another replied. "Says Pike's meaner than a rattler." Bee closed her eyes, their innocent words warming her heart more than any fire could. Even here, locked away, perhaps she had touched some lives for good. As night fell, William made his way slowly back to his cabin. Every step sent pain shooting through his head, but he had no time to rest. Inside, he carefully retrieved Bee's brother's deed from its hiding place. The paper was creased, but intact. The signatures clear and true. He wrapped it carefully in oilcloth, protecting it from the damp. The cabin felt empty without Bee's presence. No stew bubbling on the hearth, no quiet humming as she worked, no shy smile warming the shadows. William touched the bandage Nalin had wrapped around his head, remembering her promise to testify. Perhaps tomorrow would bring justice at last. He could not sleep. Instead, he spent the night in prayer, asking for strength, wisdom, and protection for Bee. When false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, he was already saddling his horse for the ride to town. The streets were quiet as he made his way to the jailhouse. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, muffling his horse's hooves. Through the barred window, he could see Bee pressed against the iron, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I'm here," he called softly. She turned toward his voice, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes still bright. "William, you came back." "Always will." He dismounted carefully, fighting a wave of dizziness. "The council meets this morning. Nalin will speak about the deed." Hope and fear mingled in Bee's expression. Will they listen? "They'll have to." William patted the oilcloth packet inside his coat. "Truth's on our side." "Be careful," Bee whispered. "Pike won't give up easily." "Neither will we." William reached through the bars to touch her hand. "Hold on to faith, Bee. God hasn't brought us this far to fail now." The sun crested the mountains, sending long shadows across the empty street. William straightened his shoulders, checking that the deed was secure. Soon the council would convene, and truth would face off against Pike's lies. In her cell, Bee pressed her face to the cold bars, watching the dawn paint the world in colors of hope. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk who had come to witness the hearing. Their whispers filled the air like rustling leaves echoing off the high ceiling. William helped Bee settle onto the hard bench beside him. Her hands trembled in her lap, but she held her head high. The shackles had left red marks on her wrists, visible beneath the cuffs of her worn dress. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from night spent on the jail's thin pallet. "You ain't alone," William whispered, his shoulder steady against hers. The courthouse doors swung open with a bang. Harlan Pike strode in, boots clicking against the floorboards. His silver watch chain glinted as he adjusted his vest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He carried a leather document case tucked under one arm. The 5 council members filed in behind their raised desk, led by Mayor Thompson. They settled into their chairs with grave expressions, shuffling papers before them. The mayor's gavel cracked against wood, silencing the murmurs. "This hearing will come to order," Mayor Thompson announced. "We're here to settle the dispute over ownership of the Collins Meadow property." He peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Pike, you may present your evidence first." Pike rose smoothly, producing a document from his case with flourish. "Distinguished council members, I hold here a deed of sale, signed and notarized, proving my rightful ownership of the meadow in question." He passed the paper forward. "As you can see, Thomas Collins sold me this land before his death. His sister's claim is nothing but fraud." The council members bent their heads over the document, passing it between them. Bee's fingers twisted in her skirt as she watched their faces. "The paper appears to be in order," Councilman Weber said slowly. "Properly signed and sealed." Pike's smile widened. "Of course it is. I'm an honest businessman, unlike some who'd try to steal what's rightfully mine." His gaze slid to Bee with unconcealed contempt. William's jaw tightened, but he kept still. They had to let Pike show his hand first. "Does anyone wish to dispute Mr. Pike's claim?" Mayor Thompson asked, looking around the courthouse. A rustle of fabric. Nalin rose from her seat near the back, her dark eyes steady as she moved forward. Her presence commanded attention, though she spoke softly. "I dispute it," she said clearly. "That paper is false." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Pike's face darkened as he turned to face her. "My husband witnessed the true deed being signed," Nalin continued. "He served as translator at the land office when Thomas Collins registered his claim. The meadow was never sold to Pike." "You expect us to take the word of an Apache widow," Pike sneered. "Your kind can't even testify in proper courts." "Mr. Pike," Mayor Thompson warned sharply, "this council recognizes all witnesses who can speak to the truth." Reverend Matthews stood then, his Bible clutched in weathered hands. "If I may, the good book speaks clearly about bearing false witness. Proverbs tells us that honest lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment." The preacher's words settled over the crowd like falling snow. Even some of Pike's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "The council will hear all testimony," Mayor Thompson declared. "Mrs. Nalin, please continue." Nalin stepped forward, her voice carrying to every corner. "My husband worked many years building trust between your people and mine. He would not lie about witnessing this deed. Thomas Collins registered the land properly, intending it for his sister's inheritance." "Lies?" Pike slammed his fist on the railing. "Where's your proof? Your husband's conveniently dead, ain't he?" "Mr. Pike, control yourself," Mayor Thompson ordered. "One more outburst and you'll be removed." William rose slowly, supporting his still healing head. "We have proof, Your Honor." He withdrew the oilcloth packet from his coat. "The original deed, sealed with Thomas Collins's signature and his military stamp." He carefully unwrapped the document, handling it with reverence before passing it to the council. The paper was creased but intact, the signatures clear and true. The council members huddled over both documents, comparing them intently. Minutes stretched like hours as they whispered among themselves. Bee hardly seemed to breathe beside William. Finally, Mayor Thompson straightened. After examining both documents, this council finds significant discrepancies in Mr. Pike's deed. The signature does not match other examples of Thomas Collins's hand that we have on file. Furthermore, the date given conflicts with military records showing Collins was serving elsewhere at the time. Pike's face mottled red. "This is outrageous. You can't—" "The council rules Mr. Pike's document invalid," Thompson continued firmly. "The original deed presented by Miss Collins appears genuine, properly signed and witnessed. The meadow property legally belongs to her as her brother's heir." "No!" Pike lunged forward, his control finally snapping. "I won't let some fat spinster steal my land." Two deputies grabbed Pike's arms as he tried to climb the council's platform. He thrashed in their grip, spittle flying as he shouted curses. The crowd drew back in shock at his violence. Bee pressed her face into William's shoulder, tears soaking his coat. But these were tears of relief, of justice, long denied finally served. William's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "Remove Mr. Pike," Mayor Thompson ordered, "and fetch the sheriff. He'll want to examine that forged deed more closely." The deputies dragged Pike toward the door, his threats echoing off the walls. The watching townsfolk began to murmur, but now their words held sympathy for Bee rather than scorn. "Poor thing, what she's suffered." Pike showed his true colors today. Never did trust that man. Nolan approached Bee quietly, touching her arm. Your brother's truth prevailed. My husband would be glad. Bee raised her tear-stained face. I thank you, she whispered. I can never repay your courage. Truth needs no payment, Nolan replied with gentle dignity. It asks only to be spoken. The council members were rising, gathering their papers. Mayor Thompson paused beside Bee's bench. Miss Collins, you're free to go. The deed will be properly registered in your name by week's end. He hesitated. The town owes you an apology for not seeing Pike's deception sooner. Bee managed a trembling smile. Thank you, sir. I hold no grudge. The courthouse slowly emptied as evening approached. Lamplight began to glow in the streets outside as William helped Bee to her feet. She swayed slightly, exhausted by the day's emotions. Let's get you home, he said softly. They stepped out into the gathering dusk. A few townspeople nodded respectfully as they passed. Near the general store, the shopkeeper who had once refused to serve Bee now touched his hat to her. The last rays of sunset painted the snow-covered streets in shades of rose and gold. Bee walked beside William, her head held high, no longer shrinking from others' gazes. Her dignity, once stripped away by cruel words, had been restored by truth and justice. William's horse waited patiently at the hitching post. He helped Bee mount, then swung up behind her. As they rode toward his cabin in the growing darkness, Bee leaned back against his chest, finally allowing herself to truly believe in her victory. Thank you for standing by me, she whispered. Always will, William replied simply, his arms steady around her as they headed home through the falling night. The courthouse steps emptied slowly as twilight deepened into evening. Lanterns flickered to life along the street, casting pools of golden light onto the fresh snow. Townsfolk lingered, gathering in small clusters, their voices hushed but warm. The excitement of the day's event still hummed in the air like electricity before a storm. William stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, one hand steady on Bee's elbow. His wagon waited nearby, horses stamping softly in the cold. But instead of leading her directly to it, he paused beneath the nearest lamppost. The light caught the scars on his weathered face, but also the tenderness in his eyes as he gazed at Bee. Miss Collins, he said softly, though his voice carried in the evening quiet. There's something I need to say if you'll hear me. Bee's heart fluttered like a startled bird. Of course, Mr. Ward. To her astonishment, William slowly lowered himself to one knee in the snow. His bad leg made the movement awkward, but his face showed only certainty. A collective gasp rose from the watching crowd. When I lost Sarah and our boy to the fever, William began, his voice rough with emotion, I thought God had cursed me to walk alone. Thought maybe I deserved it for not being able to save them. He swallowed hard. But then, he sent you to our town. Tears began to slip down Bee's cheeks, catching the lamplight like diamonds. William reached for her hand, engulfing it in his calloused grip. Pike was wrong about you. Dead wrong. You don't need to be thin or bear me sons to be worthy. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. You already carry what I lost. Faith that don't break, warmth that fills empty spaces, and the heart to make a family whole again. More townspeople gathered, drawn by the scene unfolding under the lamplight. Even those who had once laughed at Bee now watched with softened expressions. I ain't much, William continued humbly. Just a scarred mountain man with a simple cabin. But I promise to cherish you proper, to stand beside you always, and to thank God every day for bringing you to my door. He drew a shaky breath. Will you marry me, Bee Collins? Bee's free hand pressed against her mouth, trying to contain the sob that wanted to escape. For so long she had believed herself unlovable, too much and not enough all at once. But here was this good man, kneeling in the snow, offering her everything she had ever longed for. Yes, she whispered, then louder so all could hear. Yes, William Ward, I will marry you. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. William struggled to his feet, grimacing slightly at his stiff knee, but his face shone with joy as he gathered Bee into his arms. She pressed her face against his coat, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather. Reverend Matthews stepped forward from the gathering, his Bible tucked under one arm and a gentle smile on his weathered face. "I believe congratulations are in order," he said warmly. "When you're ready, it would be my honor to join you two in holy matrimony." "Thank you, Reverend," William replied, his arm still secure around Bee's waist. "We'd be grateful for your blessing." The townsfolk began to move closer, offering their own congratulations. Women who had once whispered cruel gossip now smiled genuinely at Bee. Men who had laughed at Pike's mockery clapped William on the shoulder with respect. Nalin made her way through the crowd to stand before Bee. Her dark eyes held wisdom and warmth as she took both of Bee's hands in hers. "Listen well, sister," she said softly in her melodious voice. "You are not too little, nor are you too much. You are enough, just as the Creator made you." She squeezed Bee's fingers gently. "Your heart is strong, your spirit true. This is what matters." Fresh tears spilled down Bee's cheeks at the Apache woman's words. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." William helped Bee into the wagon with tender care, tucking warm blankets around her before climbing up himself. The gathered townspeople called out good wishes as they set off, the horses' hooves making soft crunching sounds in the fresh snow. They rode home slowly through the gathering darkness, Bee leaning against William's solid warmth. The stars were beginning to emerge in the clear winter sky, diamonds scattered on black velvet. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was rich with contentment and promise. When they reached the cabin, warm light spilled from its windows, welcoming them home. William had left a good fire burning in the hearth before they departed for town. He helped Bee down from the wagon, then took care of the horses while she went inside. The familiar scent of wood smoke and pine greeted her as she entered. The cabin that had first been her refuge now felt truly like home. Bee removed her shawl and hung it carefully by the door, then moved to kneel beside the hearth. The flames danced before her as she clasped her hands together. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered fervently, "for bringing me here, for giving me strength through the trials, for sending me William." Her voice caught. "Thank you for showing me my own worth when I couldn't see it." The cabin door opened and closed quietly as William entered, stamping snow from his boots. He removed his coat and hat, then came to sit beside her at the hearth. The lamplight and fire glow played across their faces as they sat together in peaceful silence. Bee looked at the man beside her, this quiet mountain man who had defended her honor, fought for her justice, and now offered her his heart. His scars no longer seemed like marks of tragedy, but badges of survival and strength. When he caught her watching him, the corners of his eyes crinkled with warmth. Outside, snow began to drift down again, each flake catching the lamplight from the cabin windows before settling silently to earth. But inside, the fire crackled steadily, filling the small space with golden light and promise. Tomorrow would bring wedding plans and new beginnings, but for now they simply sat together, bathed in the glow of newfound joy. William reached over and took Bee's hand, his rough fingers gentle as they entwined with hers. She squeezed back, marveling at how perfectly their hands fit together, like the missing pieces of a puzzle finally united, like a song finding its harmony, like coming home at last. The fire popped and sparked, sending tiny embers dancing up the chimney. Bee watched them rise, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. She had arrived in town feeling worthless and alone, but God had turned her rejection into blessing, her shame into dignity, her loneliness into love. The lamp burned steadily on the table, its light merging with the fire's glow to fill every corner of the cabin with warmth. Outside, the snow continued its silent dance, but inside, hope bloomed like spring flowers pushing through winter earth, tender and strong and full of promise. The days following their engagement settled into a steady rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Morning frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows as Bee stirred awake on her bedroll near the hearth. William, ever mindful of propriety before their wedding, kept to his small room until they could be properly married. Dawn had barely touched the snow-laden pines when William emerged, pulling on his heavy coat. "Fences need mending," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Storm knocked down several sections." Bee nodded, already moving to stoke the fire. "I will have hot coffee ready when you come back to warm up." The morning passed with William working outside while Bee learned the daily tasks of mountain living. She watched carefully as he demonstrated how to carry water from the frozen stream, showing her where the ice was thick enough to break through safely. "Keep your steps small," he advised, steadying her arm as she balanced two heavy buckets. "The path gets slick." Though her arms trembled with the weight, Bee persevered, determined to pull her share. By midday, she had mastered the water-carrying routine, pride warming her chest despite the cold. The afternoon found them working side by side on the cabin's roof. William patiently showed her how to identify loose shingles and apply patches where needed. "Like this?" Bee asked, hammering a nail with careful precision. William's scarred face creased in a smile. "Just right. You're a natural." As the sun began to set, they moved to the woodpile. William demonstrated the proper technique for splitting logs, his powerful arms swinging the axe in smooth arcs. Bee stacked the split wood carefully, building the pile that would keep them warm through the remaining winter months. When darkness fell, they retreated inside to the welcoming warmth of the cabin. Bee prepared a hearty stew, while William sharpened his tools, the steady scrape of whetstone against metal, a comforting sound in the quiet space. After supper, they sat close to the fire, William's worn Bible open between them. His finger traced the lines slowly as he read aloud, his rough voice stumbling over the longer words. "And the Lord God said, 'It is not good that the man should be alone.'" William paused, struggling with the next passage. Bee's soft voice joined his, steady and encouraging. "I will make him an helpmeet for him." Together they read through the familiar verses, their voices blending in the lamplight. When William faltered, Bee gently helped him along, never showing impatience or judgment. News traveled slowly in the mountain winter, but word eventually reached them that Harlan Pike had left town. The sheriff reported he had headed east, his reputation in tatters after the exposure of his forgery. The town's attitude toward Bee shifted noticeably. Women who had once turned away now stopped to chat when she visited the general store. Small gifts began appearing. A sack of flour left on their wagon, fresh apples wrapped in cloth, even scraps of fabric for sewing. "Mrs. Miller said these might come in handy," Bee told William one evening, showing him the colorful cloth pieces. Her cheeks flushed pink with pleasure at the kindness. William watched her sort through the fabrics, his heart full. The sight of her making their cabin a home touched something deep within him that he had thought long dead. One particularly cold evening, William returned from checking his trap lines with unexpected company. A small boy, no more than 10 years old, followed him through the door like a shadow. The child's clothes were worn thin, his face pinched with cold and hunger. "Found him out by Miller's Creek," William explained quietly. "His folks didn't make it through the fever last month." Bee's heart clenched at the boy's lost expression. Without hesitation, she moved toward him, her arms opening in welcome. "You must be frozen through. Come sit by the fire, child." The boy, Thomas was his name, crept closer to the hearth, his thin shoulders trembling. Bee ladled out a generous bowl of venison stew, adding an extra piece of cornbread alongside. "Eat slowly now," she advised gently, settling beside him. "There's plenty more when you're ready." William stood back, watching as Bee tended to the orphaned child. She spoke softly, asking simple questions about his favorite foods and games, drawing him out bit by bit. When Thomas finished eating, she wrapped him in a warm quilt and began humming a gentle hymn. The boy's eyes grew heavy as he leaned against her side, weeks of fear and loneliness finally easing in the safety of the cabin. When he dozed off, Bee carefully smoothed his tangled hair back from his forehead. "Poor lamb," she whispered. "No child should face such loss alone." William moved to sit beside them, his presence solid and reassuring. "What do you reckon we should do?" Bee looked up at him, her eyes bright with purpose. "He needs a home, William. A family." William nodded slowly, something like hope kindling in his expression. He had seen how naturally Bee took to mothering the boy, how right it felt to have a child's presence filling the quiet corners of their cabin. Later that night, after making Thomas a comfortable bed near the hearth, Bee and William sat close together at the table. The lamp cast a gentle glow over their faces as they discussed the future. "Perhaps God gives children in ways we don't expect," Bee whispered, her hand finding William's across the rough wooden surface. William squeezed her fingers gently, remembering his earlier fears about having no sons to carry on his name. Looking at Thomas's peaceful sleeping face, He realized that family meant more than blood ties. "Reckon he does at that," he replied softly, hope shining clear in his eyes. "Reckon he knows just what we need, even when we don't." The fire crackled low in the hearth as snow fell silently outside. Thomas stirred in his sleep, burrowing deeper into the quilts Bee had tucked around him. In that moment, the cabin felt more like a home than it had since William lost his first family, not because of any grand changes, but because love had found its way back through unexpected doors. Bee resumed her quiet humming, the hymn of gratitude rising softly in the peaceful room. William closed his eyes, letting the gentle sound wash over him. Together, they sat in the warm lamplight, watching over their unexpected blessing and marveling at how God could turn loss into renewal, loneliness into family, and an empty cabin into a home filled with hope. The January storms brought deeper snow than anyone could remember. Massive white drifts blocked the narrow trail into town, leaving William's cabin isolated in the vast whiteness. Each morning, frost painted delicate patterns across the window panes while inside, Bee stretched their dwindling supplies as far as she could. William trudged out daily with his rifle, sometimes returning with a rabbit or grouse, but often coming back empty-handed, his shoulders heavy with disappointment. The game had gone to ground, seeking shelter from the brutal cold. "Don't fret," Bee would say on those nights, making thin soup from what remained. "The Lord provides enough." Though their stores grew lean, Bee kept hope alive in the cabin. Her voice lifted in hymns while she carefully measured the last of their precious flour, making small loaves that filled the space with the comfort of fresh bread. The sound drew Thomas from his quiet corner, where he'd taken to watching the snow fall. "Could you teach me that song?" the boy asked one afternoon, his thin face brightening. "Of course, dear heart." Bee smiled, showing him the words and a melody while she worked the dough. Soon, his clear young voice joined hers, bringing life to the cabin's rafters. Thomas proved eager to help, following William outside to gather armloads of firewood from the dwindling pile. His laughter, once so rare, began to ring out more frequently, especially when William showed him how to spot rabbit tracks in the snow, or taught him to whittle simple shapes from pine blocks. One particularly fierce night, a blizzard howled down from the peaks, battering the cabin with savage force. The roof timbers groaned under the weight of accumulated snow, the sound setting their nerves on edge. "We need to brace it," William said, his face grim in the lamplight, "before it gives way." Together they worked in the bitter cold, William directing as Bee helped position support poles against the straining beams. Her hands grew numb, but she persevered, passing tools and holding the lantern steady. Thomas huddled near the fire, watching with wide eyes as they fought to secure their shelter against nature's fury. During a brief pause in their labor, Bee's voice barely carried over the storm's roar. "I used to think I was useless," she confessed, looking down at her flour-dusted hands. "Too big, too plain, not good for anything but taking up space." William set down his tools and took her hands in his calloused grip. "You've saved me more times than I can count," he said firmly. "Saved this home too. Brought life back to it, when I thought it was gone forever." Tears froze on Bee's cheeks as she squeezed his fingers, the howling wind outside unable to touch the warmth growing between them. They worked through the night, and when dawn finally broke clear and cold, the cabin stood strong. Bee stirred a pot of rabbit stew, making it stretch with the last of their potatoes while William sat by the fire, carefully carving a small wooden horse for Thomas. The boy watched the knife-shaped familiar curves from the pine block, his eyes bright with anticipation. When William handed him the finished toy, Thomas cradled it like treasure. That evening, they gathered around their small table, steam rising from 3 bowls of thin stew. William bowed his head to give thanks, his rough voice sincere despite their hardships. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and most of all, for bringing us together as family." Bee reached out, taking William's scarred hand in one of hers and Thomas's small one in the other. Together they shared their modest meal, grateful not for abundance, but for the deeper wealth of belonging they had found in each other. The cabin, though cold pressed against its walls, remained warm at its heart, filled with the kind of riches that no storm could diminish. The first hints of spring crept into the mountain valley like a gentle whisper. Patches of earth emerged from beneath melting snow, dark and rich with promise. The warming air carried the sweet scent of pine and new grass, breathing fresh life into the land around William's cabin. Thomas's laughter rang clear across the meadow as he chased the speckled hens, gifts from neighbors who had slowly warmed to the unusual family. "Come back here," he called, his feet muddy from the thawing ground. The chickens scattered, clucking indignantly as they searched for early insects in the damp soil. Inside the cabin, Bee sat by the window, carefully stitching together pieces of cloth donated by townsfolk. Her needle moved steadily through the fabric, transforming scattered remnants into a new shirt for Thomas. The boy had grown over the winter months, his shoulders broader from helping William with chores. "Look how straight I made it." Thomas burst through the door, proudly holding up a small wooden figure he had carved under William's patient guidance. Bee set aside her sewing to examine his handiwork. "Why, that's the finest bear I've ever seen," she praised, noting how his whittling skills had improved. Through the window, she could see William splitting wood, his steady rhythm matching the peaceful atmosphere of their homestead. Their trips to town had changed dramatically. Where once there were whispers and turned backs, now came warm greetings and friendly waves. The general storekeeper saved seed packets for their garden, and the miller's wife often slipped extra flour into their order for the growing boy. One crisp afternoon, the preacher rode up to their cabin, his horse's hooves squelching in the spring mud. He accepted a cup of coffee from Bee, noting with approval how scripture verses now hung on the walls alongside Thomas's wooden carvings. "The Lord's presence fills this home," he commented, watching Thomas help William repair a chair. "It gladdens my heart to see such faith-bearing fruit." Bee blushed at the praise, her fingers nervously smoothing her apron. Their summer wedding plans were proceeding, though in truth they already lived as a family, bound by love rather than law. The date was set for when the wildflowers would paint the meadow in brilliant colors. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Bee's voice rose in a familiar hymn. William, still awkward with singing, hummed along as he carved by the fire. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, clapping in time, and joining the chorus with a childish enthusiasm. Their supper was simple, beans flavored with salt pork, fresh bread still warm from the oven. But the meal was rich with conversation and laughter. Thomas regaled them with tales of the chicken's antics, while William's quiet chuckles punctuated the boy's storytelling. After the dishes were cleared and Thomas was tucked into his bed, William stepped outside into the cool evening air. Stars sparkled overhead, brilliant and clear in the mountain sky. He stood silent for a long moment, his scarred face turned upward. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for second chances and new beginnings." The cabin door creaked softly as Bee joined him. She slipped her hand into his, leaning against his solid warmth. No words were needed as they gazed out over their meadow, silvered by moonlight. The land stretched peaceful before them, legally and rightfully theirs, but more importantly, it had become truly home. Bee's heart swelled with quiet joy as she listened to Thomas's soft breathing through the open window and felt William's steady presence beside her. Here, finally, she had found not just shelter, but belonging. Here she was neither too much nor too little, she was simply perfectly enough. The night air carried the scent of spring growth and possibility, wrapping around them like a gentle blessing. Their little family, pieced together from broken parts, had grown strong like William's cabin, weathering storms and emerging stronger, warmed by love and faith. The cabin glowed golden in the summer evening, lamplight spilling from its windows across the swept dirt yard. Inside, Bee stirred a pot of venison stew, the rich aroma mingling with fresh-baked bread. William sat by the hearth, his strong hands working steadily to mend a broken axe handle while Thomas carefully arranged spoons and tin plates on the table. One by one, neighbors began arriving. Widow Thompson with her 3 little ones, Nolan carrying a basket of wild berries, and the preacher with his well-worn Bible. Bee welcomed each guest with a warm smile, her cheeks flushed from cooking and happiness. The cabin filled with chatter and laughter as bowls were passed around. After the meal, when prompted by the preacher, Bee stood and began to sing. Her clear voice rose confidently, filling every corner of the room with its sweetness. Even the youngest children fell silent, captivated by the melody. William watched his wife, love softening his weathered features as her song touched every heart present. As the evening drew to a close and guests began heading home, Bee and William stepped out onto the porch. Lamplight spilled across the meadow grass, turning each blade to gold. "Once I was called too fat to breed," Bee whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But here, look what God has given." William's rough hand found hers in the darkness. "You were never too little nor too much. You were always enough." Thomas appeared between them, tugging at their joined hands. Together, the family stood beneath the star-filled sky, their cabin glowing behind them like a beacon of hope and second chances. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.